Well, everyone, it's time for us to talk about one of the OnePlus phones that, in my opinion, was one of the best phones they ever made. And it's funny because since then, a lot of people kind of forget about OnePlus. They kind of just, think it's like another random Android phone manufacturer. But OnePlus at one time, especially this time, was honestly making waves. And I was such a humongous fan of OnePlus at this time. Since then, they've kind of changed I kind of changed my outlook on them. But this was a very solid device, the OnePlus 7 Pro. And I would still say in some ways, actually, in a lot of ways, this phone is still worth it. There's a little bit of a development community behind it. It's a beautiful looking phone. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a really, really interesting phone for sure. And if you want to pick up, I guess, this phone or some other phones I recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, on the outside, you can definitely tell that the OnePlus 7 Pro is a little bit of an interesting device. I think nowadays we kind of expect all phones look like this, whatever. But if you look closely, there's no hole punch display on this thing. It's literally just a screen, and it's actually a pretty decent screen. Not only was this a massive 6.67-inch fluid AMOLED display, but it was a 1440p panel, but it was also a 90Hz panel as well. Now, nowadays we do have 120Hz and stuff, but this phone came out in 2019. That was, almost 3 years ago, from this one came out in May, and that was quite a bit of a time ago. And this thing had that type of capability, and the price tag of this thing at that point wasn't even $1,000. We would expect this phone to be like $1,000 flagship. Nowadays, OnePlus is kind of in that area, but this phone didn't even hit that price tag at that time, which was so impressive to me. And I kind of think back to OnePlus at this moment, and this was peak OnePlus. 2019 was definitely the best year from OnePlus. Even though the OnePlus 8 was a better phone, this one, it's still crazy how good of a phone OnePlus made at this point. Now, it does have that pop-up camera up top, and that's pretty much how you access the camera. Now, I always, I don't know if this was the best way to do it. I felt like there was a better way to do it at the end of the day, but I did like, the kind of creativity aspect of OnePlus, and I thought within like 2 days that camera would break, but I've been using this OnePlus for a little bit of time now, like for a couple of years, and it still works for me, so I'm still surprised that actually isn't broken or anything. Now, on the bottom, we have the USB Type-C port, which is cool, and on the back, we have a glass back on this device as well. Now, again, this wasn't a $1,000 phone. This was a kind of budget-tier device at that point. Not budget-tier, but it was like cheaper than a lot of phones in the market, and it's crazy how good of a job OnePlus was able to do and how they were easily able to make such a flagship phone at a cheaper price tag than some people would expect. Now, we also have that triple camera setup on the back. Now, not everything is perfect. This phone does lack out on two major things for the most part. There was no IP certification on this phone, and there was no wireless charging. Now, as far as I could tell, it looks like there was some waterproofness with this phone, but it was never IP certified to save money, and there was just no wireless charging, so there's nothing we can really do there. But overall, for the build quality, it's actually pretty good, and I'm still a huge fan of it for sure. Now, in terms of the camera, this thing has a triple camera setup on the back, 48 megapixel wide, 8 megapixel telephoto, then a 16 megapixel ultra-wide sensor, and on the front we have a single motorized pop-up 16 megapixel wide-angle lens, and that front camera was just so crazy to me. Now, unfortunately, we can only do 1080p at 30 on the front of this camera, which is kind of a letdown, but again, it's okay. We couldn't even do 4K at 60 until like many versions after, but with the, back camera, you are able to do 4K at 60, which is really cool. Now, I do think the camera module of this year got overshadowed by the Galaxy S10 and S10 Plus of that year, but still, for the look and, feel of this phone, the camera quality, for some reason, just made it feel better because of the build quality, which is so funny. But this phone's camera, definitely, it wasn't its strongest suit. I think OnePlus did a lot of marketing for this phone's camera. It really wasn't that great. I still kind of think it's okay for the most part, but there are still a lot of applications that I use personally besides the stock, Android camera app, things like Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram, and you can still see, you can tell who uses it like a OnePlus and who uses even like a Samsung, to be honest. There is still a lot of choppiness even between Android manufacturers within those applications. Samsung is probably one of the best, followed by Pixel, followed by all the other ones, and OnePlus falls in those other one categories. So I would definitely say the camera is probably not its best asset. It's probably one of those disadvantages of this phone. I don't think it's horrible, but again, it's one of those things to keep in mind. So in terms of the camera setup, I was kind of, not a fan of it at that point, and even now I still think it's like average at best, but what are you gonna do? It's like one of those type of things. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now, in terms of longevity, I honestly don't know how much longer this phone's going to last. I know it probably got Android 11. I'm unsure when Android 12 is going to be coming out for this thing, if it already got it. However, my specific version of OnePlus is still on an older version of Android, and I actually do like it. I would recommend updating, but even on the version that I'm on, it still feels like a very stock version of Android. Android. I don't want to go up to the more, recent whatever Color OS or whatever they have. I still love Oxygen OS, these older versions, and at this moment, it was my favorite version of Android of all time. And anytime I still use one of these older OnePlus devices, I am still just so shocked how great of a job OnePlus did at that time. Nowadays, they completely switched up, and I don't know why they did that. It's probably like a money thing, but with the OnePlus 7 Pro, I think OnePlus did a great job with the software at that point. However, now if you were to update it, it's probably a different story. But I know there is somewhat of a development community behind this, and I think there are ROMs and stuff out for this phone too. So if you're interested in that stuff, I'd recommend doing some research, and I think this phone is able to be still custom ROMmed, and I think there's still a little bit of a development community behind it. This was a pretty popular phone at one time, so I'm sure there's still some people who are interested in it. Now, ending it off with the performance, this device had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset inside of it, with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model, 8 gigs of RAM on that mid-tier model, and then 12 gigabytes of RAM on that top tier model. And like I said before, this phone's performance was really good for the age, for the price of this phone. This thing had pretty much the flagship chipset of 2019. The only disadvantage I could possibly even think of is that base model 6 gigs of RAM, but my OnePlus 7 Pro also has 6 gigs of RAM, and I think it's a pretty decent performing phone for the most part. To give you some perspective, the Galaxy S21 FE just came out, and that one also has 6 gigs of RAM on the base model, but if you get that top tier 12 gig of RAM option, that's a really large amount of RAM to have on a device like this. So I'll definitely tell you, maybe it's not perfect, it's not the best performing phone anymore, but for, light intensive type of things, this thing's going to be able to handle it. For heavier intensive applications as well, this phone is going to be able to handle it for sure too. My only disadvantage is possibly, there's some glitch frames here and there. If you're ever going to do like super heavy intensive gaming, or if you're going to do anything like in that genre, of course there's going to be some problems, but I definitely don't think it's a big deal. And as I mentioned before, this device is still a very, very good performing device, and I just don't really have too many complaints about it, so in terms of performance, that covers it up. Now in terms of battery life, this was also another pretty big advantage of this phone at that time. It was a 4000 mAh battery. Nowadays we have pretty much 4000 mAh batteries on all devices, but again, this was the flagship from OnePlus, and they did a great job. This is a 3-year-old phone now, and I think even now it still holds up very, very well, but because this phone is like pushing a couple years, the batteries degrade over time, which is totally okay, it's totally expected. But this was another pretty big asset of this phone too. So in terms of that covers it up there. And to be completely honest, I do think the OnePlus 7 Pro is worth it in some ways. I would definitely say, this is a phone that's probably not going to be supported with software super much longer in my opinion. And you're probably going to be better off if you go and upgrade at some point, maybe to a OnePlus 8 or maybe even to a OnePlus 9. But there are a lot of manufacturers who still develop a lot of Android phones. And if you want something that's a little bit more stock Android that still feels like this, you have a couple of more options. You can always pick up a Google Pixel 5a if you want to. That's still a very beautiful phone. You can pick up a Google Pixel 5. That's also a very good phone. And you can even spend a little bit more money on a Google Pixel 6 or Pixel 6 Pro. This one is a really decent phone because of its price tag. But I do think something like the Google Pixel lineup may be a little bit up your alley if you're trying to get a phone that was very similar to this type of software, but maybe has a better future in front of it. So that's pretty much all I have to say. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.